Not the winning side, not the losing side, just the battlefield. Invaded twice, occupied by two different regimes. Of all the countries caught in the Second World War, few paid a higher human price than Ukraine. Millions of soldiers, millions of civilians, and an entire generation forever changed by 6 years of occupation and war. To understand why, we need to go back to a single, cynical agreement signed in the summer of 1939. Nazi Germany and the Soviet Union, ideological enemies, secretly agreed to divide Eastern Europe between themselves. Publicly, the pact was presented as a simple, non-aggression treaty between two rival powers. A secret protocol placed Western Ukrainian lands, then part of Poland, into the Soviet sphere of influence. Germany, in turn, was given a free hand over Western Poland and much of Central Europe. Within weeks, Soviet troops marched in, and these lands were formally absorbed into Soviet Ukraine. Soviet authorities quickly began arrests and deportations of perceived political enemies in these newly annexed territories. For nearly 2 years, this arrangement held. Then, in June 1941, everything changed without warning. At dawn on June 22, 1941, German forces launched the largest land invasion in military history. Over 3 million Axis troops crossed the border along a front stretching more than 1,000 miles. Soviet military planners had not expected an attack of this scale so soon, despite mounting intelligence warnings. Adolf Hitler launched Operation Barbarossa, a massive surprise invasion of the Soviet Union itself. Ukraine, rich in farmland and industry, was one of the campaign's primary targets from the very start. Hitler himself referred to Ukraine's resources as essential to sustaining Germany's long-term war effort. Coal from the Donbass region and wheat from central Ukraine were both seen as critical wartime resources. Industrial centers like Kharkiv and Dnipropetrovsk were quickly repurposed to serve the occupying army's needs. Soviet defenses, caught largely by surprise, collapsed rapidly across much of Ukrainian territory within months. Kyiv itself fell in September 1941, following one of the largest encirclement battles of the entire war. Over 600,000 Soviet soldiers were captured in this single battle alone, a staggering number even by the standards of this war. Many of these prisoners of war faced extremely harsh conditions, with survival rates far lower than international norms of the time. Historians consider the treatment of Soviet prisoners of war one of the most under-recognized tragedies of the entire conflict. By the end of 1941, nearly all of Ukraine was under direct German occupation. Occupation authorities divided Ukrainian territory into separate administrative zones, each governed under different, often brutal, rules. Local self-government was largely dismantled, replaced by direct military and civilian administration loyal only to Berlin. Curfews, mandatory labor quotas, and severe restrictions on movement became part of daily life under occupation. German occupation authorities had a chillingly specific plan for these lands, known as General Plan Ost. The plan treated Ukraine primarily as a source of grain, raw materials, and forced labor for the German war machine. Some long-term versions of this plan even envisioned the eventual displacement of much of the local population altogether. Historians note this plan, had it been fully carried out, would have ranked among the most catastrophic in human history. Fortunately, the plan's most extreme, long-term elements were never fully implemented, largely due to Germany's eventual military defeat. Millions of Ukrainian civilians, mostly young people, were forcibly transported to Germany as laborers, known as Ostarbeiter. In total, historians estimate that more than 2 million Ukrainians were sent to Germany under this forced labor program. This was one of the largest forced population movements in European history up to that point. After the war, tracing and reuniting these displaced workers with their families took years of international effort. These workers faced brutal conditions, forced to wear identifying badges, and denied basic rights in the country they were sent to. Many never returned home, and those who survived often faced suspicion rather than sympathy after the war ended. Soviet authorities sometimes viewed returning laborers with distrust, questioning their loyalty simply for having lived under occupation. Among the war's darkest chapters was the systematic murder of Ukraine's Jewish population, part of the broader Holocaust. Before the invasion, roughly 1.5 million Jewish people lived across Ukrainian territory. Cities like Odessa, Lviv, and Kyiv had vibrant, centuries-old Jewish communities, cultural centers, and institutions. Yiddish theater, religious schools, and thriving synagogues were all part of everyday life in these communities before the war. At a ravine near Kyiv called Babyn Yar, tens of thousands of Jewish civilians were murdered over just 2 days in September 1941. Similar mass killings, carried out by mobile execution units, took place at other sites across occupied Ukraine. Historians estimate that in total, roughly 1.5 million Jewish people were murdered across Ukrainian territory during the occupation. This site remains one of the largest single massacres of the Holocaust, and today stands as a solemn place of remembrance. Before the war, Ukraine was home to one of the largest Jewish populations in the world. That community was devastated beyond recovery. Some Ukrainians risked their own lives to hide and protect Jewish neighbors, acts later honored as righteous among the nations. Ukraine today has one of the highest numbers of individuals recognized with this honor by Yad Vashem, Israel's official Holocaust memorial institution. Facing occupation from 2 totalitarian powers, some Ukrainians chose to resist, though this resistance took complicated, often contested forms. Soviet-aligned partisan units also operated throughout occupied Ukraine, sabotaging German supply lines and infrastructure. These partisan networks provided valuable intelligence and disruption that aided the broader Soviet war effort. Life in these hidden forest camps was harsh, with constant risk of discovery and limited access to food and medical care. Various partisan and nationalist groups, including the Organization of Ukrainian Nationalists, fought for an independent Ukrainian state. Their goal was a Ukraine free from both Soviet and German control, an aspiration shared by many, but pursued through very different methods. Some resistance fighters cooperated briefly with German forces against the Soviets, only to later fight against Germany as well. This history remains deeply contested. These groups fought against Soviet forces, but historians have also documented their involvement in serious violence against civilians, including Jewish and Polish communities. This complicated legacy is still actively debated within Ukraine itself, and we present it here as documented history, not as endorsement of any side. We encourage viewers interested in this topic to explore further through academic sources like HREC and Yad Vashem. Meanwhile, the tide of the wider war was turning. After their defeat at Stalingrad, German forces began a long retreat. This turning point, in the winter of 1942 to 1943, marked the beginning of the end for German ambitions in the East. Soviet industrial production, relocated far to the east earlier in the war, had begun to overwhelm German manufacturing capacity. Factories relocated beyond the Ural Mountains produced tanks, aircraft, and weapons at a scale Germany could no longer match. Throughout 1943, the Red Army pushed steadily westward, reclaiming Ukrainian territory city by city. But retreating German forces often left devastation behind, destroying infrastructure, farmland, and entire towns as they withdrew. This scorched earth approach left many Ukrainian regions economically devastated for years after the war officially ended. In November 1943, Soviet forces liberated Kyiv, a moment of huge symbolic importance for the entire campaign. Yet liberation also meant the return of Soviet authority, and with it, renewed political control over Ukrainian life. Even as celebrations took place, Soviet security services began screening the population for anyone suspected of wartime collaboration. This screening process, while intended to identify genuine collaborators, also created fear and suspicion within many communities. By late 1944, virtually all of Ukraine had been retaken, though the wider war in Europe would continue for months more. On May 9, 1945, Germany formally surrendered, bringing the war in Europe to its end. For Ukraine specifically, this day is remembered as both a hard-won victory and the closing of one of the darkest chapters in its history. Yet for Ukraine, true peace and self-determination would still remain elusive for decades to come. But liberation did not erase the staggering cost of these years. Estimates suggest between 6 and 8 million Ukrainians died during the war. This included soldiers, Holocaust victims, forced laborers, and countless civilians caught between two occupying armies. Entire cities, including Kyiv and Kharkiv, needed years of rebuilding after the extensive damage caused by years of fighting. Ukraine's agricultural output alone would take nearly a decade to fully recover to pre-war levels. Nearly every family in Ukraine today carries some memory of this war. A name, a photograph, a story passed down. The phrase, "never again," is inscribed on memorials across the country, a solemn promise carried forward by each new generation. Museums, memorials, and school curricula across Ukraine continue to preserve the memory of this devastating chapter. Oral history projects continue collecting first-hand accounts from the dwindling number of surviving witnesses. This shared memory of suffering under two totalitarian powers still shapes how many Ukrainians view questions of sovereignty and foreign domination today. Every May 8th and 9th, Ukraine, like much of Europe, pauses to remember the immense cost of victory over Nazi Germany. These stories remind us that history isn't just about dates and battles. It's about the people who lived through them. But peace, once again, would not last long. A new empire to the east was about to reshape Ukraine's future once more. If this history moved you, please subscribe and take a moment to reflect on how much was sacrificed here. Do you have a family story from this era? We'd be honored to hear it in the comments below.